Chalmers has just wrapped up that address to the press club. I want to go live to my colleague, senior political reporter Trudy McIntosh. Trudy, the message was clear. He's up for a discussion on reform, substantial reform here.
Yeah, this is one of these press clubs, Kieran, I think will be notable in the years to come. Jim Chalmers clear there that he is bold in his appetite for economic reform. We remember this from the first term. The Treasurer said he was up for these big conversations, but it seemed to essentially be scuttled in part. Now, having secured a much bigger number of seats in Parliament, the Treasurer wants to have this big conversation, ruling almost nothing out. I thought was interesting. Even that question on the GST, asked multiple times, not an explicit ruling out, was it, of change in that area. Jim Chalmers clearly up for this conversation, Kieran. I thought interesting the contrast from what we saw from the Prime Minister a week ago here at Press Club. His message had been clear that this is about a second term delivering on what you took to the Australian people. Jim Chalmers, I asked him whether you'd need to secure a mandate, therefore, for some of these key reforms if they're to emerge from the round table. He said, well, you have to wait and see what it is, and that potentially they do legislate some big reforms before the next election rather than waiting to head to the polls for a second time, Kieran.
And one of the key things in that context, Trude, is if you get, if they're able to get the consensus around the table and then reach across the aisle as well. And, you know, I know it's hard to imagine right now, but if you can get consensus with the major parties, that is another way to try and drive this reform. And if the coalition believe they're in opposition for a few terms anyway, they know you've got to put the budget on a firmer structural footing. Maybe now's the time to get it done.
Well, interesting then in that context that the Treasurer, Kieran, is not making it clear that the opposition will have a seat at the table. He's clearly saying it's going to be a small room. This is a much more slimmed-down version of the Jobs and Skills Summit we saw in 2022. It's going to be held inside the Cabinet Room of Parliament. They said 25 seats, and that's going to dictate who's in the room. I suppose the slimmed-down size of that means you maybe get consensus in the room, but what about more broadly in the community? The task for Jim Chalmers, Kieran, is to convince the Australian people on some of these big reforms. You heard questions there asked about, inevitably in tax reform, there are people who lose out. How does this government convince people that, yes, in terms of big economic reforms in the past, there have been winners and losers? It's incumbent on the government to make that case, not just seek consensus in the room of 25 people, but rather more broadly in the Australian community.
Yeah, you're right, though. This looks like it's one of those press club addresses that will be remembered as at least as the starter's gun for what is going to be a discussion for many months to come on reform. We'll see how up for it they are, because it's not always that smooth, is it, Trudy? Regardless of a big majority in Parliament, obviously this was before your time in the Parliament, but you go back to '98, before my time as well, actually. But that's the GST election. Howard had a massive majority. He had a massive majority, and it was whittled away very, very quickly by an effective opposition. And that's the other thing. What do we see here? Is there going to be consensus? Will there be opposition? Does it become a political fight?
But I suppose that becomes the central question is, if you get a thumping majority, what are you willing to use it for? Are you willing to spend that political capital on big reform? We saw John Howard do that. But the other example of this that strikes my mind, Kieran, is that conversation between the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison, about the GST. More than 5 years ago, that was a conversation that got away from the government. They seem to be losing political capital on an idea they never eventually actually pushed forward with. So there are dangers in these starting what is a pretty broad conversation about tax reform, but Jim Chalmers believes he's got the ticket to do it, and we'll see in coming months what these proposals actually are.
Yeah, just don't ask him to rule anything in or out. That's off the agenda now. He said, please stop it. No rule in, rule out. Trudy, thank you for that. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon.